Rome in 38 CE looked invincible. The legions marched, the forums buzzed, senators debated beneath marble colonnades that had stood for centuries. Everything appeared ordered, magnificent, eternal. The empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, its borders held firm. Its wealth flowed like blood through a living body. To the world, Rome was a monument to human civilization itself. But behind the palace doors on the Palatine Hill, something was rotting from the inside. A 15-year-old girl walked into that palace that year. Her name was Messalina. She was supposed to be a solution, a young bride to stabilize an aging emperor, a vessel of virtue to heal a dynasty still scarred by Caligula's madness. The Senate praised the match. Priests blessed it. Citizens celebrated in the streets, believing that fertility and noble blood would restore dignity to the throne. History would remember her very differently. This is the story of how an empress turned Rome's greatest strength, its rigid moral code, its obsession with power, its fear of scandal, into a weapon so devastating that the empire's most powerful men found themselves trapped not by armies but by shame. Before empires crumble under siege, they often decay from within. Before the barbarians come, the rot begins at home. Messalina didn't need legions. She had something far more effective, the ability to see what men feared most and the will to weaponize it. If you enjoy these dark chapters of history, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Now, let's step back into the world of ancient Rome, where an empress learned that control could be bought with humiliation, and that the fall of the greatest empire might begin not on a battlefield, but in a bedroom. This is the story of Messalina, the woman Rome tried to erase from history, and the scandal that whispered the empire's final warning. The public saw what Rome wanted to see: a beautiful woman of noble blood, pale skin, golden hair, the kind of face that commanded attention. She bore Claudius children, a son and a daughter, quickly and without complication. She appeared at state functions with practiced grace. She maintained the rituals of respectability. By every measure Rome applied to women, she was the ideal consort, the perfect matrona, the virtuous wife, the embodiment of everything the empire demanded from a woman of her station. What if perfection was the disguise? The whispers started in the darker corners of the city, in the tenements of the Subura district, in the servants' quarters of noble homes, in the barracks where soldiers drank cheap wine and spoke truths they'd never utter in daylight. The rumors moved like water finding cracks, impossible to stop, spreading through Rome's lowest and highest reaches alike. Word spread, growing more elaborate with each telling, of an empress who slipped from the palace at night, not to visit a lover in secret, not to pray at a shrine, but to disappear entirely into another life. She moved through Rome's red light district like a phantom, her face hidden beneath cheap paint and grease deliberately applied to obscure her features. Her body offered in the very brothels that Rome's elite pretended not to visit, the establishments they used while maintaining public virtue. She took money for her services as if she were any common prostitute. She gave no special treatment, demanded no recognition. She competed directly with the professional women of the Subura, and those who somehow recognized her faced a choice: silence or ruin. But this wasn't desperation. It wasn't poverty or madness or the thrashing of a caged woman desperately seeking escape from an unbearable life. It was something colder, something far more calculated, a deliberate exploration of everything Rome forbade her to be. She was born into supreme status, married to an emperor, blessed with beauty and power and access to every pleasure the world could offer. Yet none of it satisfied her. Instead, she moved toward the forbidden with the precision of a hunter stalking prey. Every night she violated the code of chastity demanded of her. The contrast grew sharper. The more the empire idolized her purity in daylight, the more intoxicating it became to shatter it in darkness. She had discovered something that would define her entire reign: the erotic power of contradiction. The thrill came not from the acts themselves, but from the audacity of them, from knowing that somewhere across the city, senators and generals she would greet with perfect courtesy. Tomorrow were unaware they'd been in her presence, from the knowledge that she was fooling everyone. The brothel was her rehearsal. The palace became her stage. By the early 40s CE, Claudius's court had transformed into something unrecognizable to those who remembered the years before her marriage. The banquets no longer celebrated policy or military victory or the expansion of the empire. They became theater, grotesque, suffocating theater where the rules of Roman society were inverted and weaponized. Silk draped the couches. Wine flowed in rivers imported from distant provinces so expensive that a single cup cost what a laborer earned in months. Golden platters overflowed with roasted dormice, figs heavy with honey, exotic fruits brought at tremendous expense from lands the Romans had conquered. But the true spectacle was human. The real entertainment was degradation. Senators found themselves summoned under pretense of honor, invited to attend what were ostensibly celebrations of the gods or commemorations of military victories. Only when they arrived did they realize they'd been lured into chambers where their fears were already known, where the Empress had collected intelligence on their weaknesses, their secret loves, their financial desperation, their political rivalries, their hidden shame. Generals stood before her, stripped not just of their armor, but of their dignity, before rivals who whispered their secrets into the ears of other rivals, ensuring that humiliation would follow them home to their families. Noble daughters disappeared into the palace for days, summoned under orders they couldn't refuse, and returned days later with haunted eyes that wouldn't meet their father's gaze. Aristocratic women were coerced into acts they would never confess, bound together in shared shame that became a chain stronger than any lock. Young men from the best families found themselves in scenarios they couldn't explain, couldn't escape, and couldn't survive socially if exposed. Messalina had learned something that Rome's emperors before her had not, something that would prove more destructive than any plague or invasion. She understood that information was a weapon more effective than steel. She ruled not through decree or law, but through knowledge. Every confession whispered in shame, every act performed in degradation, every secret was collected, recorded, carefully catalogued. Her loyal attendants tracked everything, wrote everything down, preserved every detail that could be used later. Governors were chosen not for competence or military ability or administrative skill, but for complicity, for silence, for the fact that they had something to hide. Generals remained loyal, not through honor or patriotism or love of Rome, but through terror of exposure. Senators made decisions not based on what was best for the empire, but on what would protect them from the empress's knowledge. The Roman state itself was being twisted by invisible hands, shaped by the fear of one woman's power. She had constructed what amounted to an imperial brothel hidden in plain sight. Not in the Subura district where common prostitutes worked, but in a lavished villa near the Campus Martius, disguised as an elegant residence of an aristocratic family. Aristocratic women were forced to serve there under threat of ruin, their families destroyed, their names dragged through scandal, their reputations obliterated if they didn't comply. Senators and generals and wealthy merchants arrived under false pretenses, believing they were attending private entertainments, only to discover they were being compromised in ways that guaranteed their absolute silence. Every trembling secret born in the heat of shame was recorded. Later accounts claim she used that knowledge to blackmail entire families into submission, securing wealth without having to ask for it, extracting governorships through whispered threats, obtaining absolute obedience without raising a single legion. The small scenes from this period are chilling when you imagine them in detail. Picture a young noblewoman dragged from her father's atrium in daylight, brought to the villa and forced to act the courtesan under Messalina's watchful eye, while the empress made notes, observed everything, recorded every detail. Imagine senators stripped of their togas, the symbols of their rank and authority, compelled into degrading displays before rivals who would later exploit that disgrace in ways both public and private. One soldier who managed to escape the villa later admitted when finally safe that the experience had been worse than battle. "Blood dries," he said. "Shame never does." He had survived combat that killed his brothers. Yet the memory of what he'd been forced to endure in the Empress's chambers haunted him more deeply than any wound. This was Messalina's cruel brilliance. She had discovered that sexual humiliation could break men more completely than the sword. She had understood something fundamental about power, that it doesn't live in declarations or titles or authority on paper. Power lives in the secret places. It lives in what people fear will be revealed. It lives in the moment when someone realizes they are completely trapped. Her cruelty marched with spectacle, hand in hand, growing bolder with each passing year. By the early 40s CE, her gatherings were notorious among Rome's elite. Disguised as festivals celebrating Venus or Bacchus, they began with solemnity and ritual. Incense climbed toward the gods. Priests offered prayers. Then gradually the atmosphere would shift. The ceremonies would slide into staged orgies where the ruling class performed acts they would never dare confess to anyone outside those chambers, never dare explain to their families, never dare acknowledge in public. Messalina conducted the entire scene like a maestro conducting an orchestra. She orchestrated every moment, controlled every element. Senators were paired deliberately with enemies, watching each other humiliate themselves. Generals were forced into grotesque contests, designed to strip them of authority and dignity. Noble wives were unveiled before roaring circles of the elite, their bodies on display, their shame manufactured and watched and recorded. Refusal meant disaster, not minor social consequences, but genuine ruin. Families would be destroyed. Fortunes would vanish. Careers would end overnight. Men would die mysteriously. Women would find themselves accused of crimes that guaranteed execution. Compliance meant ruin of a different kind. The ruin of knowing what you'd done, of living with that knowledge, of knowing that others held that power over you forever. Everyone left the palace bound not by loyalty to the emperor or devotion to Rome, but by shared and suffocating shame. They were all equally trapped. They were all equally compromised. And that was precisely how Messalina wanted it. The most disturbing accounts from this period focused less on public display and more on her need to compete, to constantly test herself against others. She treated sex as a gladiator treats combat, as a competition where there had to be a winner and a loser, where victory meant proving yourself superior. Her most infamous contest, the endurance match against Scylla, Rome's celebrated prostitute, shocked even the jaded capital. Before a select audience of nobles, Scylla, who had built a reputation across Rome for her physical stamina and experience, paced herself carefully through the night. She tended to 25 men through the long hours, one after another, until exhaustion finally took her. She collapsed as dawn approached. Everyone in the room believed the contest was over. Everyone assumed Messalina would acknowledge Scylla's victory, or at least claim a draw. But the Empress didn't stop. She continued past 30 men, refusing to yield, pushing beyond physical exhaustion, driven by something beyond mere lust or competition. It was about proving a point, that she could exceed even the professionals, that there was no limit to her, that she was fundamentally different from and superior to every other woman in Rome. She continued until no volunteers remained, until there was literally no one left. By dawn, the Empress of Rome had won her victory. She had turned herself into a spectacle, reigning in degradation, not as disgrace, but as triumph. The nobles who witnessed it sat in horrified silence. This wasn't the behavior of an empress. This wasn't the conduct of a matrona, a virtuous wife. This was something else entirely, something that violated every notion Rome held about gender, power, and respectability. And yet she had made it work. She had made her degradation into a demonstration of absolute power. Why would a woman raised in privilege, adored for beauty and crowned as empress, deliberately embrace degradation as her highest pleasure? Historians and psychologists have searched for answers across the centuries. Some argue it was insatiable lust, an appetite that could never be satisfied no matter how many times it was indulged. Others point to a hunger for power, to the idea that controlling men through sex was the deepest form of dominion. Some scholars see trauma in her story. She was married off at 15 to a man more than twice her age, a man whose body was failing, whose mind was sometimes uncertain, whose authority was absolute. In marrying Claudius, she lost autonomy completely. Everything about her was controlled. What she wore, where she went, who she could speak to, what she could do. Perhaps in her secret nights in the brothel, In her orchestration of humiliation, she was reclaiming the only power available to her, the power of her own body, used on her own terms for her own purposes. Perhaps the truth is simpler and more chilling. For Messalina, the contrast was intoxicating. The more her public role demanded chastity and virtue, and the embodiment of respectability, the more thrilling it became to betray it completely. The gap between who she was supposed to be and who she actually was created a kind of psychological electricity that drove her forward. She was living two completely separate lives, and the danger of the secret, the constant risk of discovery, may have been more addictive than any physical pleasure. Her empire of lust had far-reaching consequences that rippled through Rome's political structure. The Senate, already weakened by previous decades of instability and violence, found itself frozen by blackmail. Governors were chosen not for ability or experience or military skill, but for their vulnerability to compromise. Generals stood loyal not through honor or patriotism, but through fear of exposure. Rome's policies were twisted under her unseen hand, shaped by the need of powerful men to protect their secrets rather than serve the empire's interest. Foreign envoys who came to Rome to conduct diplomatic negotiations reported back to their own governments of something strange happening. Senators who should have been sharp and engaged seemed subdued, distracted, almost broken. Negotiations that should have been straightforward became inexplicably complicated. Men who should have been advocates for particular positions seemed oddly reluctant, as if they were concealing something, as if their minds were elsewhere. Rome's leadership was being consumed from within by one woman's fixation. One woman's hunger for power expressed through control and shame. The machinery of the empire, which had functioned for centuries with remarkable efficiency, was beginning to rust from the inside. Decadence breeds enemies. This is a law as old as civilization itself. The soldiers who had long tolerated imperial excess, the lavish banquets, the sexual indulgences, the display of wealth, began to mutter. They were hardened men who had fought in distant provinces, men who had seen comrades die, men who had learned to accept the cruelty of the world. Yet loyalty frayed when rumors spread that their own comrades had been summoned to Messalina's villa and stripped of dignity before her guests. For men hardened by war, humiliation was worse than death. It was worse than pain. It was a violation of something fundamental. The barracks rang with whispers and curses that elsewhere would have meant treason. Men spoke openly of the Empress in ways that would have resulted in execution if reported. The muttering grew louder, the discontent grew deeper, and Messalina, from her position of absolute power, could feel the ground beginning to shift beneath her feet. Her paranoia swelled in response. Guards around her tightened, her security increased. Punishments for any hint of disloyalty or disrespect grew harsher. The spectacles turned crueler, as if doubling the shame could somehow strangle rebellion in its cradle. Each act cut new cracks into the fragile facade of her dominion of desire. She could feel it, even if she couldn't admit it. The system she had constructed was becoming unstable. Power maintained through fear and shame alone is inherently precarious. Rome had survived fire, plague, and invasion. It had endured civil wars and tyrants and military defeats. Could it survive an empress who ruled through degradation? Could the empire's structure withstand the weight of her corruption? These questions were beginning to be asked, not just in whispers, but in deliberate conversations among those who still had the courage to speak. The breaking point arrived in 48 CE, with an act so bold, so reckless, that it still staggers historians more than 19 centuries later. While Claudius was away in Ostia on military business, Messalina staged a wedding. Not a secret tryst in the darkness, not a private oath exchanged between lovers, not a hidden ceremony performed in shadows and fear, but a full Roman wedding. A real marriage ceremony, conducted in daylight, witnessed by priests and senators and members of the court. She married herself to a senator named Gaius Silius, a young, attractive man who had been her lover for some time. Not metaphorically, not in secret, but legally. The priests attended, witnesses signed. Contracts were sealed with all the formality and ritual that Rome required. Every element that a real marriage demanded stood in place to legitimize the union. The auspices were taken. The gods were invoked. The vows were exchanged. She was now married to Silius, while still holding the title of Empress and wife of the reigning Emperor Claudius. This was not mere scandal. It was not even a dramatic affair. It was open revolt. She stepped out of shadow into daylight, her lust transformed into treason. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. What could have driven her to such madness? Did she believe that Claudius would simply submit, that the Senate would yield, that Rome would accept 2 husbands for its empress? Did she think the emperor too weak or too old to respond? Did she believe that the web of blackmail and shame she'd created was so comprehensive that no one would dare move against her? Or was it something else entirely? Compulsion, the need to escalate, the addiction to risk that had driven her entire life. Was she simply unable to stop, unable to restrain herself, driven forward by a hunger that could only be satisfied by greater and greater acts of transgression? Whatever the motive, the act proved fatal. It proved to be the moment when the system collapsed. Loyal freedmen, men who served the emperor and owed their loyalty to him rather than to the empress, ran to inform Claudius of what had happened. At first the emperor laughed. Surely it was a wild rumor, an exaggeration, gossip that had spiraled out of control. It seemed impossible. Even Messalina, with all her audacity, couldn't be mad enough to actually marry someone while married to the emperor. As proof accumulated, as witnesses came forward and contracts were produced, as the details became undeniable, laughter turned to anger. The emperor, who had been mocked and cuckolded by his own wife, whose authority had been undermined by her actions, whose very legitimacy as the supreme power in Rome had been challenged, finally moved. Claudius returned to Rome with soldiers at his back, with authority restored, with the power to act. Messalina was found in the gardens of the palace she had ruled like a goddess of vice, like a sovereign power unto herself. The gardens where she had walked countless times in triumph, where she had orchestrated so many scenes of humiliation, where she had exercised absolute power over those around her. Now she was cornered, trapped, her escape routes cut off. Ancient writers describe her last moments with cold clarity, their language almost clinical in its precision. She begged and pleaded for her life. She offered her children as hostages to save herself, using the only bargaining chips remaining to her. When mercy did not come, when no appeal could move the emperor to spare her, she tried to take her own life. She searched for poison, for a blade, for anything that would allow her to escape the consequences, but she faltered. She couldn't follow through. At that final moment, her will broke. A soldier thrust the blade home. The empress who had enslaved Rome through shame died not in grandeur, not with the dignity of an imperial death, but in panic and blood. She died begging. She died afraid. She died discovering that the power she had wielded so completely was not absolute after all, that it could be taken from her in a moment, that all her schemes and manipulations had led ultimately to this, to death in a garden, to ignominious collapse. Her punishment did not stop at death. That would have been too merciful for someone who had violated Rome's moral code so completely. Claudius ordered her statues thrown down, a command that was carried out with almost ritualistic fury. Her name was erased from every record that could be changed, from every public inscription that could be chiseled away. Her memory was condemned to oblivion, a punishment called damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory reserved for Rome's greatest threats and enemies. Yet Rome never forgot. The more they tried to bury her, the louder her legend grew. The more they attempted to erase her, the more persistent her presence became. Stories spread across the empire. Writers recorded her deeds. Her scandal became the standard by which all future imperial excess would be measured. She became a cautionary tale, told by mothers to daughters, a warning whispered in the corridors of power, a ghost that haunted the Roman imagination. Stand in the Palatine ruins today, and the silence feels heavy with meaning. Visitors may admire the mosaics, the intricate tile work that has survived the centuries. They may marvel at the engineering that allowed such structures to endure for nearly 2,000 years. Yet beneath the dust of ages, the stones murmur of something darker. They whisper of the brothel hidden in plain sight. They recall the nobles who were caught and executed, They remember the blackmail that entangled Rome's most powerful families. They echo with the forbidden marriage that challenged imperial authority. Messalina's tale endures not because Rome wished it told, not because the empire desired her legend to live, but because it couldn't be silenced. The story was too great. The scandal was too profound. The implications were too threatening to ignore. In the end, her legacy is a warning carved across centuries, a lesson written in the corruption of power and the collapse of morality. Empires do not fall only to invasion. They do not crumble only when enemies breach their walls or barbarian hordes sweep across their frontiers. They collapse from corruption that ferments within their own walls, from the slow rot of moral decay, from the poisoning of the very systems that hold them together. Messalina proved that lust can be as destructive as steel. She showed that shame can bind men more tightly than chains. She demonstrated that the most dangerous weapon is not the sword, but the secret. Not the army, but the knowledge of what someone has done, what someone has become, what someone has been forced to endure. History closes her chapter with a truth as brutal as her life. Rome's most dangerous weapon was not steel. It was the body of an empress who understood that power flows not from authority, but from the ability to make others afraid of exposure. It was the knowledge that civilization rests on a foundation more fragile than we dare to admit. That the line between order and chaos, between respect and degradation, between strength and collapse, can be crossed by a single person with enough audacity and enough hunger for transgression. Messalina crossed that line, and Rome, the empire that had conquered the world, nearly collapsed from the corruption she unleashed. The stones still stand, the palace still draws visitors from across the world, but somewhere in that silence, in that weight of history, Messalina's shadow lingers. The girl bride who became the most feared courtesan of her time, the empress who ruled through shame, the woman who nearly brought the greatest empire in history to its knees, not with armies, but with the deliberate wielding of her own power. Her story poses a question that chills across the ages, that remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. What happens when the one chosen to embody virtue crowns herself with vice?